Notice how Nurse O'Brien documents, minimally, barely meeting standards, the kind of shortcuts that get hospitals sued. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 48 minutes before Admiral Hartley's heart stopped beating. Seattle General in San Antonio hums with the particular silence of early morning rounds. Fluorescent lights cast everything in a pale institutional wash. Megan O'Brien moves through the ICU with the kind of invisible efficiency that makes work look effortless, adjusting for drips with one hand, reading monitor displays with peripheral vision, her scrubs pristine despite the 13-hour shift that started at 7 the previous evening. She walks with a slight favoring of her left leg, a reminder of something that happened overseas and officially never occurred. Admiral Hartley occupies Bedford in the cardiac recovery wing. 72 years old, post-surgical, commanding presence even horizontal on a hospital mattress. He commands a destroyer group, USS Decatur, part of the naval task force operating in the Arabian Gulf. Megan had known this information for approximately 6 hours. She had not mentioned it to anyone. She would not mention it to anyone. Her hands move through the morning assessment with practiced precision. Heart rate steady. Oxygen saturation climbing steadily. The Admiral's eyes track her movements with the alertness of a man who has spent 51 years making decisions under pressure. She does not make eye contact. Eye contact leads to conversation. Conversation leads to questions. Questions are dangerous. The ICU smells like antiseptic and underlying copper, the blood smell that never quite washes out of hospital walls no matter how many times they sanitize. Her badge hangs against her chest, dangling from a lanyard, the laminated face slightly worn at the corners from 18 years of wearing it through shifts, through certifications, through performance reviews that had always said the same thing in slightly different words: competent, reliable, quiet. The morning chart notation takes her for minutes. She uses the precise terminology required by protocol: EF 48%, ejection fraction stable, troponin levels trending down, no signs of post-surgical infection. Her documentation is meticulous because meticulous documentation has a purpose: it creates a record. Records protect patients. Records protect nurses. Records protect the truth. At 6:52 a.m., Dr. Caldwell enters the ICU wearing a tailored white coat that probably cost more than Megan's monthly car payment. He is accompanied by 18 residents, a teaching round. Medical students orbit him like planets around the sun, their notebooks already open, their postures already slightly bent toward deference. Caldwell moves with the particular gait of a man who has never been questioned. Tall. Expensive watch. The kind of presence that makes the air pressure change when he steps into a room. He stops at Admiral Hartley's station first. Perfunctory examination. Standard questions. The Admiral answers clearly, direct, military training visible in the economy of his speech. Caldwell nods, makes a note for the residents, moves to the next bed. Then he circles back. Nurse O'Brien, he calls across the ICU. Not a request. The tone carries weight. The residents shuffle closer, sensing a teaching moment. She approaches. Her jaw remains unclenched. Her breathing remains steady. Composure is armor. Caldwell holds up her chart. Walk us through your documentation here. She does. The entries are chronological. Every vital sign recorded. Every medication administered. Every observation noted with timestamps. Her voice remains level, technical, efficient, factual. She does not offer extra explanation. She does not apologize. She simply presents the work. Notice, Caldwell says to the residents, his voice taking on the cadence of someone delivering a lecture, the minimal notation. Nurse O'Brien documents the absolute minimum necessary to meet baseline standards. Notice the lack of narrative assessment. A real nursing record should tell the story of the patient's progression. This, he gestures at her chart with 2 fingers as if it smells bad, this is the kind of shortcuts that get hospitals sued. This is liability masquerading as efficiency. The residents scribble notes. One of them glances at Megan with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been the first tendrils of contempt. She does not look at him. She does not look at Caldwell. She continues charting without a word, her hands moving with deliberate steadiness, her posture unchanged. Caldwell lingers for 3 more seconds, long enough to make a point. Long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. Long enough for everyone present to understand that this was performative, that this was about establishing hierarchy in front of witnesses. Then he moves to the next patient. The residents follow him like ducklings. The ICU returns to its humming quiet. Megan's jaw unclenches. She breathes. She continues her charting. The morning progresses. By 10 o'clock, she has completed her assessment on 6 patients. By 1 o'clock, she has responded to 2 call lights, coordinated with pharmacy about a medication adjustment, and spoken to a patient's daughter for 14 minutes about expected outcomes. The work is steady. The work is invisible. The work is exactly what she has been doing for 18 years, and what she did before that in a different uniform, in a different capacity, under a different name. Around 3 p.m., she walks to the vending machine in the break room. The fluorescent lights flicker slightly as she feeds in $2 bills. The machine hums. Behind her, she hears voices she recognizes. Caldwell and 2 board members. She does not turn around. She presses the button for coffee. The cup drops with a hollow plastic sound. Hot liquid pours. The aroma of instant coffee fills the small space. The staff these days, Caldwell is saying, they think experience exempts them from protocol. Think they know better than administration. His stage whisper carries perfectly in the enclosed break room. He is not trying to be quiet. He is trying to be heard. 20 years on the floor and suddenly the rules don't apply. That's the problem with tenure. Creates entitlement. Megan reaches for her coffee. The cup is hot enough that she needs to hold it carefully. She could turn around. She could respond. She could say any number of things that would be absolutely accurate and absolutely fatal to her continued employment. Instead, she walks out. She holds the door open with her hip, the coffee warming her palm, and she walks down the corridor without accelerating her pace, without clenching her jaw visible enough to show muscle tension, without giving anyone the satisfaction of reaction. Behind her, one of the board members laughs. A nervous laugh. The kind that happens when someone says something ugly and the group is unsure whether to agree or retreat. Megan returns to the unit. Admiral Hartley is resting. His monitor shows steady rhythm, nice clean lines on the display, the mechanical beep 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 of normal sinus rhythm. She pulls up the afternoon charting on her computer and begins recording. The coffee cools in her hands while she works. Between patients, she takes the stairs instead of the elevator. Stairs are quieter. Fewer people. She descends to the basement level where the locker room maintains the temperature of a walk-in freezer. Her locker is the 3rd one on the left side. The combination is still in her muscle memory, 14, 32, 4. The door opens silently. Behind her winter coat and the small purse she keeps for personal items, wrapped in plastic and hidden in shadows, sit a pair of combat boots. They are laced properly. The leather has cracked in places from repeated exposure to desert heat. The soles bear wear marks from terrain that does not exist on any map available to the general public. She had worn them in places that were officially denied. She had worn them during operations that had been scrubbed from every database, every official record, every government document that had ever acknowledged her existence. Fallujah. Jolan District. 3-month rotation under code name Valkyrie 6, operating as part of an EOD team that was officially not there, under command authority that came directly from JSOC via classified channels that left no paper trail. She had performed emergency medical procedures in conditions that would have made any ICU doctor's hands shake. She had held lives together with field medicine and pure will. She had saved 11 people in a single night while mortars turned the sky into hellfire. And then the order had come. The operation was being closed. The team was being disbanded. The participation was being erased. All evidence of Valkyrie 6 was being destroyed. Everyone involved understood what that meant. You no longer existed in that capacity. You had never existed in that capacity. You returned to your previous life and you never spoke of the other one. Master Chief Petty Officer O'Brien had ceased to exist. Megan O'Brien, RN, had continued forward. She reached into the locker and touched the boot. Just once. The leather was cool. It was real. It was proof. It was the only proof that she had ever been anyone other than the quiet nurse that Dr. Caldwell had just humiliated in front of 20 residents. The locker room remained empty. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Outside, San Antonio's summer heat pressed against the building. Inside, she held the material evidence of a life that nobody could ever know she had lived, and she thought about how many times she had reset the timeline: 18 years as a nurse, 8 years before that as something else, 8 years before that as someone's daughter, and all of it accumulated into a person who could absorb insults without flinching, who could hold her composure while her competence was systematically mocked, who could stand in a break room and hear her name dragged through condescension without turning around. The thing about survival was that it never really ended. You just learned different ways of staying invisible. She closed the locker. The lock clicked into place. The boots remained hidden. Dr. Caldwell circled her like a predator during grand rounds, 20 residents trailing behind like ducklings caught in a current they couldn't escape. Megan stood beside Admiral Hartley's bed, her scrubs pristine despite the 14-hour shift, her hand steady as she adjusted the 4-line for the 3rd time that morning. The cardiac monitor beeped its mechanical rhythm, steady, reliable, the only voice in the room that didn't carry judgment. "Let's use Nurse O'Brien as our teaching example," Caldwell announced, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that required no effort. He tapped her chart with his pen, the sound like a judge's gavel. "Notice the minimal documentation. Barely meeting standards. The kind of shortcuts that get hospitals sued." He didn't look at her when he said it. He looked at the residents, watching their faces light up with the glow of someone else's humiliation. This is what happens when experience creates complacency, gentlemen. Staff members who believe they're above protocol. Megan's jaw clenched once, a single muscle twitched beneath her skin that lasted less than a second, then relaxed. She continued charting without a word, her composure absolute. The pen in her hand moved with the same precision it always did. Her vital signs didn't spike. Her voice didn't shake. She simply continued working, as if Caldwell were background noise, as if his words were the fluorescent hum of the ceiling lights instead of accusations designed to break her in front of an audience. One resident whispered to another. Both smirked. Caldwell leaned closer, his presence invasive as a hand on her neck. "Do you have anything to contribute, Nurse O'Brien, or shall we assume you agree with my assessment? The documentation meets Joint Commission standards, Doctor." Her voice was even. Quiet. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse than this. All required elements are present. He smiled, cold as a surgical steel instrument. "Barely. That's the problem with barely, isn't it? Barely isn't excellence. Barely is mediocrity with tenure." He turned back to the residents, already moving on, already finding his next target. The damage was complete. The message was clear: this nurse was a cautionary tale. By mid-morning, Megan stood at the vending machine in the break room, feeding quarters into the slot with the same measured rhythm she used for everything. Coffee. Black. No sugar. The machine hummed and groaned, delivering her cup with the mechanical certainty of something that followed rules. She inserted another quarter for a second cup, an old habit, the kind of small kindness that had survived even when everything else had been erased. The break room door opened. Caldwell entered with 2 board members, Dr. Reeves, whose appointment to the board had been announced 3 months ago, and Administrator Thompson, whose tie cost more than Megan's monthly car payment. Caldwell didn't acknowledge her. He didn't need to. He positioned himself close enough that she would hear every word, far enough that he could deny intention if confronted. Some staff think 20 years of experience exempts them from protocol, Caldwell said to Reeves, his voice pitched at the precise volume of someone speaking to a colleague while being overheard. They become liabilities. Particularly in critical care where documentation is everything. Thompson nodded, the kind of automatic agreement that required no actual thought. We've had concerns. Just between us, there are gaps in her file that don't quite add up. Employment history that raises questions. Megan felt his eyes burning into her back like thermite eating through steel. She could have turned. Could have defended herself. Could have explained that the gaps in her employment history were classified, that the documentation she kept was meticulous because precision had once meant the difference between a team coming home or not coming home. She could have named her rank, her unit, her code name, Valkyrie 6, the call sign she hadn't spoken aloud in 8 years. Instead, she picked up her coffee and walked away, refusing to turn, her hands perfectly steady even as her pulse rate climbed like an aircraft reaching altitude. That afternoon, Caldwell found her in the hallway outside the medication room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. His voice was low, almost friendly, the voice of a man confident in his power. Security will be monitoring medication room access more closely, he said, standing close enough that she had to choose between backing away and holding her ground. She held it. Just so you're aware. We've had concerns about certain staff members. Medication discrepancies. Nothing concrete yet, but we're tracking it carefully. There were no medication discrepancies. Her counts had been perfect for 18 years. But that didn't matter. He wasn't making a statement of fact. He was making a threat dressed in policy language. Understood, Doctor. 2 words. That was all she gave him. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Nothing about him reached that far. I'm glad we understand each other. She nodded once and continued to her next patient, her body mechanics perfect, her breathing controlled, her face a mask of professional neutrality. A passing nurse, Sarah Chen, one of the good ones, looked at her with something like pity. Word was spreading. Caldwell was building something, and everyone who worked in this hospital knew what that meant. That evening, Caldwell activated his network from his office on the 14th floor. The city sprawled below his window like a conquered territory. He picked up his desk phone and made 4 calls in rapid succession, each one a carefully placed chess piece in a game Megan didn't yet know she was losing. First call, Dr. Reeves on the hospital board. Just wanted to flag some performance concerns before they become liability issues. One of our ICU nurses, Brian. I'm not saying there's a pattern, but documentation gaps, attitude problems during teaching moments, the kind of thing that makes you wonder about judgment in a crisis situation. Caldwell's voice was reasonable, measured, the voice of a man who was simply being thorough. Might want to pull her file. I've already documented my observations. Second call, the State Nursing Board. I'm filing a routine credential inquiry. There are some employment gaps I need verified, just want to make sure everything's in order. Could take a few weeks to process, I imagine. But better to be thorough, right? The voice on the other end assured him they would look into it. Bureaucracy moved slowly. That was fine. Caldwell wasn't in a hurry. Third call, Derek Morrison, the private investigator. They had a history. Morrison had helped Caldwell with 3 previous situations, each one resolved quietly, each one leaving no fingerprints. I need a complete background check. Employment history, military service if applicable, personal connections, anything that doesn't add up. Cross-reference against federal databases if you can. I need to know if there are inconsistencies in her timeline. Morrison didn't ask questions. He simply quoted a price and confirmed the timeline. Fourth call, Administrator Thompson, who still remembered how Caldwell had made a malpractice lawsuit quietly disappear 3 years ago, the kind of pressure applied in the right places that had convinced a family to accept a settlement instead of going public. I need you to support a performance improvement plan for one of the ICU nurses. I've already documented initial observations. Nothing dramatic yet, but there will be paper trail. You'll need to sign off on escalation protocols if things progress. Thompson agreed before Caldwell even finished the sentence. Debt worked better than loyalty. By evening, the wheels were in motion. The state nursing board would request Megan's employment records. Derek Morrison would dig into archives and databases looking for the kind of inconsistencies that classified military service created. Dr. Reeves would begin reviewing Megan's file with fresh suspicion. Administrator Thompson would have his legal team prepare documentation for a performance improvement plan that would require her to prove herself innocent of charges that hadn't been formally filed yet. Megan sat in the staff lounge at 7 p.m., reviewing Admiral Hartley's updated chart. The cardiac readings showed deterioration. Pericardial effusion building. Early signs of tamponade, fluid accumulating around his heart like a threat that grew with each passing hour. She documented it carefully, flagged it for the on-call team, used the precise language that would ensure whoever took over her shift understood what they were looking at. This patient was crashing in slow motion. Whoever was on duty tonight needed to be ready. Sarah Chen approached, sliding into the chair across from her. The break room was empty except for them. The coffee maker gurgled in the corner, producing something that barely qualified as beverage. Megan, Caldwell's been asking questions about you all morning, Sarah said quietly. Wanted to know about medication errors, patient complaints, anything that didn't add up. He's building something. Everyone knows it. Thanks for the heads up. Megan's face remained neutral. Not unconcerned, simply controlled. The distinction was important. He's not going to stop until he forces you out, Sarah said. I don't know why, but he's decided you're a problem that needs solving. Megan didn't respond. She couldn't explain that she already knew this was coming, that people like Caldwell always sensed weakness in the form of things that didn't make sense, gaps that begged to be filled, and her employment history was a minefield of gaps that classified military operations had created. She simply thanked Sarah and finished her shift. Alone in her locker room 30 minutes later, she opened her locker to the space where her scrubs hung like skin she had shed and would shed again tomorrow. Behind them, hidden beneath spare uniforms and an old pair of compression socks, sat her combat boots. The leather was creased and worn from 8 years of storage. The soles were scuffed where desert sand had worked its way into everything: boots, uniforms, skin, memory. She touched them once, her fingers tracing the outline of scars in the material, then closed the locker door. Not yet. The boots would stay hidden. The woman who had worn them would stay hidden. Megan O'Brien, the nurse, had no choice but to remain exactly what she appeared to be: quiet, competent, and invisible. Her phone buzzed as she walked to her car. A text from Marcus, her 17-year-old son. How's the Admiral doing? My CO says he's the best. She typed back slowly, he's stable. Focus on your studies. She didn't tell Marcus that Admiral Hartley was the man who had commanded the destroyer group where her son wanted to serve. She didn't tell him that Hartley's condition was worsening with each shift. She didn't tell him that the man who had saved her life in Fallujah was now drowning in his own pericardium, and she was watching it happen from the sidelines while her career was systematically dismantled by someone who couldn't see past his own arrogance. The parking lot was nearly empty. Rain had started falling, hammering the asphalt like applause for a performance nobody wanted to see. She sat in her car without starting the engine, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her breathing controlled even as something deep inside her began to calculate odds and timelines and the number of moves she had left before Caldwell forced her hand. The monitor's alarm screamed at 2:38 a.m. like a siren that wouldn't die. Megan's eyes snapped open before her feet hit the floor. Admiral Hartley's blood pressure had plummeted in the time it took her to finish charting in the break room. 70/40. Then 60/30. The numbers dropping like a stone through dark water. She moved without thinking, muscle memory pulling her through the doorway and into the ICU bay where the Admiral lay pale as hospital linen, his jugular veins distended like cords about to snap. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, utterly indifferent to the crisis unfolding. His lips had turned the color of slate. 50/20. Dr. Chen, the on-call resident, stood frozen beside the crash cart, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't open the pericardiocentesis kit. His eyes were wide and glassy, the look of someone whose training had evaporated the moment the patient became a person with stars on his shoulder boards and the weight of command in his unconscious face. I need to, Chen's voice cracked like a teenage boy's. He reached for the needle with fingers that trembled like leaves in autumn wind. Pericardial tamponade. The Admiral's own blood trapped in the sac around his heart, squeezing it with every beat until there was no more squeezing left to do. 60 to 80 ccs of blood turned murderous. Megan was already moving. The crash cart opened with a whisper. Subxiphoid approach. 18-gauge needle. 45-degree angle toward the left shoulder. The words came out calm and precise, words that didn't belong to a floor nurse in a hospital gown and worn Crocs. Words that belonged to someone who had performed this exact procedure in a trench in Fallujah while mortars turned the night into daylight. Chen fumbled with the ultrasound transducer, his hands refusing to cooperate. The Admiral's pressure dropped to 50/20. There was no time for training wheels. There was no time for anything except what needed to happen in the next 90 seconds, or there would be no Admiral Hartley anymore, just a body getting colder under fluorescent lights. Step back. Her voice carried the kind of authority that made Chen's feet move before his brain could argue. He stepped back automatically, responding to something primal in her command, the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, someone who had called commands in combat zones where hesitation meant body bags. She took the needle. Her hands were utterly steady, the tremor completely absent, the kind of hands that had held together 11 lives in an operation that officially never happened. Muscle memory from Fallujah trenches under mortar fire guided the catheter between ribs with surgical certainty that took 45 seconds flat. She felt the slight give as the needle penetrated the pericardium, that particular resistance that meant you were in exactly the right place. The hiss of air escaping. Blood flowing into the syringe, dark and urgent, 60 ccs drawn in one fluid motion like she'd done it 1,000 times before. The Admiral's blood pressure climbed. 60/40. 70/45. 80/50. The color began returning to his lips, that faint pink that meant oxygen was getting somewhere it mattered. The code team crashed through the doors exactly 10 minutes after Megan had already stabilized him, their movements fast but unnecessary, their urgency meeting a crisis that had already been solved. They stopped short, processing the scene, the Admiral with color returning to his face, the bloody pericardiocentesis needle on the sterile field, Chen standing pale against the wall, and Megan O'Brien still holding the blood-filled syringe with the kind of composure that belonged in operating theaters, not ICU bays. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part arrived 7 minutes later in street clothes and a face the color of a thunderstorm. Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway like something summoned by the universe to ensure the night would be completely destroyed. Someone had called him. Security, probably, or the rapid response team who'd seen the commotion and figured administration needed to know that a floor nurse had just performed a surgical procedure that required physician oversight. His eyes locked onto the scene with the precision of a hunter spotting wounded prey. His gaze swept from the Admiral to Chen to the crash cart to Megan, and she watched him understand exactly what had happened. His face shifted through several colors, red, purple, a shade of crimson that suggested his blood pressure was doing its own dangerous climbing. Everyone out. His voice was ice water poured over broken glass. Now. Except Nurse O'Brien. The code team filtered out quickly, exchanging glances that said they understood they were leaving behind a minefield they didn't want to be in. Chen lingered for just a moment, his eyes meeting Megan's with something like gratitude and something like apology mixed together. She gave him the slightest nod, not a dismissal, not a command, just an acknowledgement that he'd done the right thing by stepping back. Caldwell closed the door with a soft click that sounded like a gun hammer cocking. "What," he said slowly, each word a separate sentence, "did you just do?" Megan set the syringe down on the sterile field with meticulous care. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. She'd faced worse than an angry administrator in a hospital hallway. She'd faced it at night, under fire, with lives depending on her next breath being steady. Pericardiocentesis, she said. 60 ccs of blood was compressing his heart. You performed a surgical procedure. Not a question. An accusation. His voice had taken on that particular tone he used during grand rounds, the tone that turned surgical precision into recklessness, competence into shortcuts, survival into protocol violations. You are a floor nurse. The patient was dying. That's not your decision to make. He stepped closer, and the air in the bay seemed to contract, pressure changing the way it does before a storm. That's beyond your scope of practice. That's practicing medicine without a license. That's a board of nursing violation, a state law violation, and grounds for immediate termination. She didn't respond. There was nothing to say that would change what was happening. She could hear the calculation in his voice, the opportunity crystallizing. He'd been looking for an excuse to destroy her, and she'd just handed him not one excuse but an entire arsenal. I'm documenting this as a patient safety incident, Caldwell continued, his voice smooth now, the voice of a predator who'd just caught his prey exactly where he wanted it. You'll be removed from this shift, pending investigation. Human Resources will contact you within the hour. He walked to the Admiral's bedside and checked the monitors with the air of someone reclaiming territory. The Admiral's blood pressure was holding steady now, 92/55, climbing toward something that resembled normal. His heart rate was coming down from the 120 range. Her hands had done that. Her knowledge had done that. Her willingness to break the rules had saved his life. But it had also just ended her career at Seattle General. Caldwell didn't look at her again as he left, but his shadow lingered in the bay like something physical, something that had weight and cold and the smell of diesel exhaust and ambition. The door closed behind him with a kind of finality that sounded like a closing argument in a courtroom where the verdict was already written. Megan looked at Admiral Hartley, still unconscious, still pale, but breathing steadily, his heart no longer drowning in its own sack. He would live. She'd made sure of that. She'd done what her training demanded, what her oath required, what her hands had been built to do across 12 years and 3 tours and a classified operation in Fallujah that officially never happened. And now she was finished. The quiet nurse who'd finally shown her hand. The floor nurse who'd stepped outside her lane and performed medicine without a license and saved a patient's life in the process. Caldwell would make sure everyone knew what she'd done. Not that she'd saved the Admiral, but that she'd violated scope of practice. Not that she'd shown surgical precision, but that she'd overstepped her authority. She could already feel the walls closing in, the institutional machinery grinding to life, the machinery that would chew up her career and spit out the remains as a cautionary tale for other nurses who thought they could do more than their job description allowed. She pulled off her gloves and stepped back from the bay, leaving the blood-stained needle on the sterile field as evidence of what she'd done. What she'd risked. What she'd already lost in the moment she'd stepped forward without asking permission, without waiting for someone with the right title to take over. Rain had started somewhere outside, she could hear it hammering against the hospital windows like applause for a performance nobody wanted to give. Megan stood in the ICU bay with Admiral Hartley's steady heartbeat the only sound that mattered, and she began counting down the hours until security would escort her from the building, until the investigation would begin, until the woman she'd been as Master Chief Petty Officer O'Brien would finally have to stop pretending to be someone she'd never been allowed to become. Dr. Caldwell's voice cut through the ICU like a scalpel before his body even crossed the threshold. 10 minutes. That's how long it took him to arrive after the code team stabilized Admiral Hartley's sinus rhythm, and those 10 minutes had been enough time for him to work himself into something that resembled fury the way a hurricane resembles wind. His face was the color of raw liver, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles at his temples pulsed visibly. He stopped 3 feet from Megan, who was finishing her charting at the bedside station, her movements deliberate and measured, her hands steady as surgical instruments. You performed a pericardiocentesis, he said. Not a question. An accusation. His voice had dropped to that dangerous register that senior physicians used when they wanted to sound controlled while actually detonating. Without physician supervision. Without authorization. Without even basic protocol review. Megan didn't look up from the chart. She was acutely aware of the other nurses pretending to work, the respiratory therapist suddenly very interested in a ventilator setting that hadn't changed in hours, the resident standing frozen near the medications cart. The whole unit had gone silent the way a forest goes silent before a predator feeds. "I saved his life," Megan said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the kind of weight that made the silence deeper. Not defensive. Not angry. Just fact. Just data. "You violated scope of practice," Caldwell snapped back. "That's a board violation. That's a legal liability. That's exactly the kind of cowboy nursing that gets hospitals sued and patients killed." He stepped closer, his presence making the air itself feel compressed. "Admiral Hartley coded because of inadequate monitoring on your watch, and then you took it upon yourself to perform a procedure that requires a physician. That's not heroism. That's criminal negligence wearing a cape." The lie was so clean it took a moment to recognize it. The Admiral had coded from a spontaneous bleed into the pericardial sac, a vascular event that had nothing to do with monitoring and everything to do with the fact that his pericardium was slowly drowning his heart. But Megan said nothing, because saying something meant defending herself, and defending herself meant this became about her competence instead of her compliance. The longer he thought she was just a nurse who'd overstepped, the safer the secret stayed buried. "By the end of business today, I'm having you suspended pending investigation," Caldwell continued, and now he was speaking loud enough for the whole unit to hear. "For gross violation of scope of practice. For endangering a patient. For insubordination." He paused, letting each word land like hammer strikes. "Security will escort you from the premises. You'll surrender your credentials, your badge, and your access card. You're done here." Megan closed the chart with a soft click. Then she turned to face him, and for just a moment, one moment, something flickered in her eyes that made the younger nurses actually step backward. It was the look of someone who had performed a surgical procedure in a combat trench while explosions rewrote the geography around her. It was the look of someone who had held lives together with hands that were bleeding. But then it was gone, replaced by the neutral expression of a nurse who had nothing left to lose and everything to lose simultaneously. "I understand," she said quietly. By 9 a.m., the entire department knew. Caldwell had called Dr. Patricia Martinez, the hospital president, before dawn, gave her the narrative he'd been constructing for weeks, heavy on protocol violations and light on context. He'd called the state nursing board escalation line and filed a formal complaint. He'd called his private investigator, Morrison, and told him to accelerate the background check on O'Brien, find something, anything, some gap that explained why she was dangerous. And he'd called Administrator Thompson, leveraging the malpractice cover-up from 3 years prior, the one Thompson thought was safely buried. Thompson owed him. Thompson always paid his debts. The department assembly happened in the hospital's main conference room at noon. 30 nurses, 5 residents, 3 attendings, and security. Caldwell stood at the podium like a prosecutor at a trial he'd already won. His presentation was pristine, a timeline of Megan's documentation errors, a chart showing her above-average patient loads, statistical manipulation that made her efficiency look like corner cutting. Everything true enough to be devastating. Everything just angled wrong enough to become a weapon. "Effective immediately," Caldwell announced, his voice carrying the tone of a man delivering justice. "Nurse Megan O'Brien is suspended pending investigation for gross violation of scope of practice. Her actions endangered a patient and violated fundamental nursing protocols. We will not tolerate this level of recklessness at Seattle General." 2 security guards moved forward. One was Frank, an older man with a veteran's bearing and a small American flag pin on his uniform. He was a veteran himself, had been enlisted before he took the security job, but he didn't know that he was escorting a Master Chief Petty Officer out of the building. He was just following procedure. Just doing his job. Sarah, one of the nurses who'd worked with Megan for 4 years, stood up. "This is insane. Megan, fight this. He's lying. The Admiral coded because of a bleed, not because of anything you did. Everyone in that ICU knows what actually happened." But Megan was already moving toward the door. She removed her badge from around her neck as she walked, the laminated photo of her face with M. O'Brien, RN printed beneath it. She placed it on the conference table with the same care someone might use to lay down a surrender flag. She didn't look back at Sarah. She didn't look at Caldwell's face, which had arranged itself into an expression of grim satisfaction. "I understand the decision," Megan said to no one in particular. Her voice didn't waver. Her hands didn't shake. This was because she'd been trained in worse situations, had made harder choices, had survived scenarios where shaking hands meant dying hands. But also because she couldn't fight. Couldn't defend herself. Because the moment she started questioning the investigation, the moment she started demanding they prove what they were accusing her of, someone would ask questions back. Someone would dig into her background. Someone would find the gaps. 8 years ago, after a classified operation in Fallujah that officially never happened, the Navy had erased Master Chief Petty Officer O'Brien from every database. Orders came down through channels so secret that even her commanding officer could only reference them in private. She was alive, officially, but she was no longer her. No records of service. No discharge papers. No pension eligibility. Just a civilian nurse named Megan O'Brien with a high school diploma and a weird gap in her background that didn't quite add up. The military had needed her to disappear so completely that asking questions about her existence would only expose the operation, expose the classified nature of what they'd all been doing in that trench. Fighting back meant investigation. Investigation meant exposure. Exposure meant the government that had ordered her to become invisible would have to decide whether she stayed disappeared. So she walked through the corridors of Seattle General in silence, flanked by Frank and another security guard named Mitchell, while nurses stared and residents whispered and one attending actually shook his head in something that might have been disgust or might have been doubt. The elevator doors opened and closed like the punctuation of a life being edited out of the narrative. The parking garage air was cool and tasted like concrete and car exhaust and the faint copper residue of old rain. Her 2006 Honda Civic sat in the same spot it had for 3 years. Silver paint faded by San Antonio sun. Tires with maybe another 6 months of tread. She slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, and the sound was so final it almost felt like safety. But it wasn't safety. It was just silence. The engine was dead. She couldn't turn the key because turning the key meant driving somewhere, and she had nowhere left to drive to. The apartment she rented month to month, she could pack in an hour, leave before the landlord heard the news. But then what? Another city? Another alias? She'd already been Megan O'Brien. She'd built something here. She'd helped people. She'd almost let herself believe that the woman the Navy made her become could actually exist in daylight. Forehead pressed against the steering wheel. Hands gripping at 10 and 2 like they might still remember how to steer. Her phone buzzed once, twice, 3 times. Marcus. Her 17-year-old son, who went to John Jay High School and had joined ROTC because his mother had hidden enough secrets that he'd learned to respect them without understanding them. He was calling. She couldn't answer. Because if she answered, she'd have to tell him that the job she'd been hiding behind for 8 years, the respectable civilian life that proved she was normal, had just been erased by a man in a white coat who didn't know what he was erasing. 20 minutes passed. Maybe 30. The concrete walls of the parking garage closed in with every breath. Rain started somewhere outside, hammering against the upper levels in a rhythm that sounded like applause for a performance nobody wanted to give. She was invisible again, but this time she had nowhere left to hide. The ghost the Navy made her become had no more places to disappear into. That was when the world started changing, though she didn't know it yet. Marcus burst through the hospital board meeting doors like a storm condensing into human form, his 17-year-old frame moving with the precision of someone who'd spent for years in ROTC learning how to carry weight that wasn't physical. The shadow box in his hand caught the fluorescent light, its glass face reflecting the faces of 20 board members who had no idea what they were about to witness. His voice cracked on the first word, the only fracture in his composure, but the words themselves carried the weight of 8 years of classified silence finally breaking open. "Mom, they need to see these." The room didn't respond. It waited. Board members exchanged glances, confused at the interruption, at the boy in dress blue standing in their administrative sanctuary with something that looked like it belonged in a museum. Admiral Hartley sat in his wheelchair near the window, still pale from the blood loss, still moving like a man learning to breathe through a second chance. His eyes found Marcus first, then tracked to the shadow box, and something shifted in his face, recognition, understanding, the dawning of a moment that had been buried so deep it had calcified into permanent darkness. The Navy Cross caught light like a prayer. "That's impossible," Thompson whispered, leaning forward. Caldwell's face darkened, that purple rage building again, because he was losing control and he could feel it slipping through his fingers like sand through a closing fist. "Security, this is." Admiral Hartley raised one hand. Not high. Just enough. The room obeyed. He rolled his wheelchair forward with the measured momentum of a man who'd learned to move through spaces differently, and he took the shadow box from Marcus with hands that trembled, not from weakness, but from 8 years of weight finally finding its proper place to rest. "I need to say something," Hartley said, and his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who'd commanded destroyer groups and made decisions that cost lives and saved them in equal measure. Something that should have been said 8 years ago in a classified briefing room at the Pentagon. He raised the microphone. The feedback squealed once, a sound like something breaking, and then settled into silence so absolute you could hear the ventilation system breathing above the ceiling tiles. "That woman," Hartley said, and his eyes found Megan standing against the back wall where security had left her, performed a pericardiocentesis in a combat trench in Fallujah while I bled out and mortars turned the night into daylight. She was operating under codename Valkyrie 6. She held the rank of Master Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy. She saved 11 lives that night, 11. And then the Navy buried the whole operation and erased her from existence. The words hung in the air like shrapnel suspended mid-flight. "That's classified information," Caldwell started, but his voice had lost its blade. It was just noise now, the sound of a man realizing he'd been making accusations against someone he'd never actually seen. "No," Hartley continued, "it was classified. Past tense. The operation was declassified 6 hours ago on direct order from the Secretary of the Navy. Master Chief O'Brien is not a nurse operating beyond her scope. She's a decorated military officer whose credentials are older and deeper than anyone in this room has clearance to understand. A veteran security guard, Frank, whose name Megan had never learned despite him escorting her from the building just yesterday, stood up from where he'd been leaning against the wall. His posture changed. His eyes found the Navy Cross. His hand moved to his chest in a salute that came from muscle memory built over decades of respect for rank he recognized. "Master Chief on deck," he said quietly, and the word seemed to unlock something in the room's chemistry, because 2 other staff members stood, then 3 more, and suddenly the boardroom was filling with people standing in recognition of something they finally understood. Caldwell tried to move toward the door. That was when the woman in the Navy dress uniform entered through the side entrance, not walking, moving like someone who'd learned to displace space rather than travel through it. Navy JAG. The insignia was unmistakable. The efficiency of her presence was absolute. "Dr. Caldwell," she said, and her voice carried the particular sharpness of military protocol meeting civilian incompetence. "You filed false performance reviews against a decorated Master Chief Petty Officer operating under federal protection orders. You suspended her for performing a life-saving procedure identical to her military specialty. You contacted a private investigator to probe classified service records. You made 4 phone calls documenting intent to remove her from this hospital based on fabricated grounds." "I was ensuring patient safety," Caldwell said, but his confidence was gone now, evaporated like morning dew under direct sun. "No," the JAG officer said, handing him a folder thick as a patient's medical record. "This is documentation of your 4 previous complaints against nurses who questioned your authority. 2 were veterans. All complaints were fabricated. One of those nurses, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, is currently here as a witness to your pattern of retaliation against military personnel." Sarah stood from her chair in the back corner, her expression tight and controlled. He told me last year that questioning his antibiotic choice would result in my termination, she said flatly. He made good on that threat 3 months later using a fabricated medication error I never made. Another nurse stood. Then another. The network that Caldwell had built through fear and institutional power started unraveling in real time, each strand breaking as people finally spoke truths they'd been holding like stones in their chests for years. Dr. Reeves literally stepped backward, creating distance between himself and the man he'd been using to consolidate control of the department. I was given incomplete information, Reeves said to the JAG officer, his voice careful and already practicing its next career chapter. Administrator Thompson's phone rang. She looked at the screen, and her face drained of color the way a patient's does when bad news arrives. The board chair, she whispered, answering with a voice that belonged to someone watching their future collapse in real time. The JAG officer didn't wait for the call to finish. Your investigator Morrison is now under federal investigation for attempting to access classified military databases. Administrator Thompson is suspended pending review of the 2019 malpractice cover-up that you referenced in your phone call to Dr. Reeves. Thompson lowered the phone. Her hand shook. This was the moment when institutional power became institutional liability, when the favors called in and the records buried suddenly had dates and signatures attached. Effective immediately, you're terminated, the JAG officer said to Caldwell, and her tone suggested this wasn't a negotiation. Security will escort you from the building. Frank stepped forward, the same security guard who'd escorted Megan out yesterday, his face now carrying the particular kind of shame that comes from understanding you helped destroy someone you should have protected. His uniform felt heavier than it had that morning. He took Caldwell's badge and keys with the mechanical precision of someone performing a duty that felt like a correction. The hallway that Caldwell had ruled through intimidation and institutional position became his corridor of reckoning. 24 hours earlier he'd walked this same path with security on either side of him, but then they'd been removing someone. Now they were removing him. Residents watched from doorways. Nurses appeared in the hallway. A resident whispered to another, "That's called karma," and the words followed him like his own footsteps. That evening, every San Antonio news channel carried the same image, Megan O'Brien standing on the hospital steps in full Navy dress uniform for the first time in 8 years, flanked by Marcus in his Rotk dress blues and Admiral Hartley in his wheelchair. The Secretary of the Navy himself stood to her left, his dress whites crisp as paper folded by machines. The Defense Distinguished Service Medal hung suspended between them and her chest, waiting for its moment. Her worn combat boot sat on the podium beside the American flag. Not hidden. Not shameful. Just there. Allowed to exist in daylight. The medal was pinned with precision. Marcus stood at attention, tears streaming freely down his face, not the controlled tears of military protocol, but the overwhelming release of a son watching his mother finally be seen for who she actually was. His hand trembled during the salute. That was permitted. That was understood. Admiral Hartley spoke to the cameras with the authority of someone who'd made the decision to declassify 8 years of silence because some truths were more important than some secrets. Master Chief O'Brien saved my life twice, he said. Once in Fallujah under mortar fire. Once in this hospital under institutional fire. She did it while being systematically destroyed by a man who feared competence he couldn't control. The camera panned across the staff filling the hospital steps, Sarah, Dr. Chen, Frank saluting with genuine respect now, even Dr. Reeves standing with the posture of someone learning humility through professional consequences. Hospital workers who'd watched the transformation unfold over 24 hours now understood they'd witnessed institutional correction in real time. 2 weeks later, a news follow-up showed Caldwell sitting at a folding table in a strip mall, business cards reading supplemental insurance specialist. His office had no nameplate. His clientele would be walk-ins. His references would be checked by no one. This was the particular punishment of consequence, not dramatic ruin, but the slow suffocation of anonymity after years of demanding recognition. Back at Seattle General, Megan returned to work in a new role, Director of Critical Care Training. Her credentials were no longer hidden. They were framed on her office wall, a photograph of her in desert camouflage at age 26, her rank visible on her collar, her name finally allowed to exist in the official record. The combat boots sat on a shelf beside her shadow box. The Navy Cross hung on the wall beside her diploma. She trained residents in pericardiocentesis technique with hands that had performed the procedure under conditions they'd never encounter in a civilian hospital. Her voice carried quiet authority, not the defensive precision of someone trying to prove competence, but the settled certainty of someone whose competence was finally recognized. Sometimes the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, she told a new resident during the third week of training, guiding their hand to the correct intercostal space with the same patience she'd learned in military medicine when teaching meant the difference between someone living or bleeding out. The resident looked at her, really looked at her, and finally saw what everyone should have seen from the beginning, a Master Chief Petty Officer in scrubs, a woman whose silence had been a choice, not a limitation. Marcus shipped out 3 months later under Admiral Hartley's command, carrying a photograph of his mother in dress uniform in his service record. He wore the uniform with the same quiet authority she did, not because it ran in families but because they both learned that respect was something earned through action, not demanded through rank. That's the power of finally being seen. Subscribe to witness more stories of hidden strength exposed, of quiet warriors recognized, of institutions forced to confront the people they tried to erase. Hit like to show support for the Master Chiefs among us who serve in silence. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Your stories matter.